Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we're checking out a video from the channel The Infographic Show. The video is titled Why Japanese Soldiers Never, capitalized, used shields. Now, I don't know, I still haven't watched the video, so I'm gonna sort of react with it with you, but of course I have a problem with the sentence because it's not true. The Japanese warriors never used shields, but it is also possible that it's one of those situations where they're just using a clickbaity title, but then they tell you on the video, no, actually Japanese soldiers did use it, it's just blah blah blah. So I'm interested to see if that's the case. You probably already know, because I mean, did I call this a reaction, a response, a debunking? It sort of depends on that, and you already know that and I don't. Isn't that strange that you know something I don't? Even whatever. Let's go.
You're in the middle of a blood-soaked Japanese battlefield a few hundred years ago, watching as your fellow warriors all get cut down around you by ruthless samurai. While you're wondering if there's any hope of escape, a particularly infamous samurai spots you and decides you'll be an easy kill.
Well, already I have to say I really like the animations and the graphics. I love channels that do this. There are a few other channels that I watch, and I imagine it takes a lot of time and dedication to create the animation, so I always respect that. Let's continue.
He runs toward you, unsheathing his katana and preparing to strike a lethal blow. The last thought that goes through your head while you still have a head might be something like, why am I not carrying a shield right now?
Okay, I don't know if that would have been the thought of a Japanese warrior, but I understand where they're coming from. It's their introduction to the video. No problems with that. In fact, I actually appreciate the fact that he mentioned the beheading, because that was something that was very common on Japanese battlefield, particularly during the Sengoku period, because the head was something that you would bring to your feudal lord at the end of the battle to gain a reward, and the more important the person you took the head from was, the better your reward. And another interesting piece of information that I could add is the fact that some samurai would put perfume on their hair and inside their helmets, get this, so that if they did lose during the battle and their head would be severed, they wouldn't inconvenience the person who cut their head off with a sweaty head, and instead it would make a good smell. Also for the that's insane. Only the Japanese. Let's go.
The battlefields of historic Japan played host to many arms and armor that have become famous across the entire globe. Who doesn't immediately think of the katana sword and iron mask of the Oyoroi armor when asked to picture a powerful samurai warrior?
Not sure if the mask is the first thing that I would think. I think the first thing that I would think is, yes, I imagine the sword, particularly the public would think the sword, even though it wasn't the main weapon, it was a backup weapon, a spear, bows, and eventually matchlock type arquebuses being the main weapon. But the mask, for me, it's the helmet. What about you? What's the first thing you think about when you think of a samurai? Let me know in the comments. And subscribe, come on, click it.
The naginata polearm is also a well-known Japanese weapon, seen as an equivalent to the European glaive, neither of which has anything to do with Kroll. Sorry, fantasy fans. Japan was also known for the heavy use of bows and arrows, which often decided the winner of a battle long before and even after guns began to serve a similar function in the Sengoku period.
Well, so far we're 1 minute in, and I appreciate the information they're spreading. And note how, of course, it's a little superficial, but that's the type of videos they make. But it's interesting that he's saying that bows and arrows remained very important. Well, he says like it could be the deciding factor. I think there is a lot more that goes into a battle, and not just a volley of arrows and you won. I mean, I can't think of one battle, honestly, it just went like that. But still, the fact that he said that arrows and bows remained pertinent even after firearms entered the equation is very true. In fact, there is some data, I'll have to revisit, but there is some data that tells us that for every gunner, you needed to have like 4 or 5 archers deployed. So even when firearms become a thing and are mass-produced in Japan, bows and arrows don't just go away. They still remain an important tactical unit within your Japanese feudal armies. Interesting.
But of all the many implements of the war that the Japanese used in their most famous battles, there doesn't appear to be any clear equivalent to the shields that were used in Europe and other parts of the world.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the way the shield is represented in the cartoon, because they're showing this. It looks a little bit like a heater shield. Note that the top has this little indentation. Now, I looked, because I made a video I think about it a few years ago, maybe not that many, but I was specifically looking for that, and I did find it, but it took forever. Like, I had to go through, I want to say 500, 600 different images on manuscripts and miniatures. You'll find a link in the description, and every time I would just see the one that is like straight, and then it becomes like a triangle, the more common heater shield. This did exist, this little thing on the top, it exists, but it's very, very rare. I'll see if I can pull up the image that I found for you. And because I found it, and then I put it on the ring that I produce and sell link in the description. Shameless plug. Let's see if I can sell a few rings as well. They're really nice though. They really are nice. And that's why I could justify it historically, but they are very, very rare. But that's not really what's annoying me here, is the fact that it's full metal with all the little rivets around. That's not a thing. They were made of wood and usually covered with parchment, with linen, gesso, not like that.
It's not one that is nearly as famous as any on the previous list of iconic weapons, but this is actually a common oversight, born out of a misunderstanding of the full scope of military development in Japan.
Very nice. So I'll see if they then bring in a good example of, for example, the original Tedate, I suppose, or the Tate. But yeah, let's see if they talk about the stationary shields, if they talk about the handheld shields. Let's go.
While the popular image of samurai warfare paints a vivid picture, that cultural touchstone is only a fraction of the truth. It's a misconception largely based on the legendary reputation of the samurai as peerless swordsmen who fought with lightning speed, with both of their hands firmly on their blades. But there were other warriors who fought on Japanese battlefields throughout the ages, and among those were a select few in need of portable defenses.
Excellent. So far I'm happy with the information they're presenting. So I suppose that so maybe this won't be a debunking video. It's possible that it's just going to be a little response to add to the information they're giving. That's nice for a change, unless you know something that I don't, with the title and the thumbnail. But so far, so good. And they're mentioning the pre-samurai era soldiers of the Iron Age. Let's see.
So today we're going to explore the history of shields in Japanese warfare. We're going to find out definitively when the armies of Japan used shields, what kind of shields or similar armor are unique to Japan, and why ultimately the shield fell out of prominence during the samurai era and beyond. So put away your bows, spears, and swords, because it's time for the unsung shield heroes of Japan to rise up. The best place to start is by defining the utility of the shield and how it's intended to be used. A standard handheld shield is meant to provide an active defense against the edge or piercing weapons of the enemy.
Well, I would say that the primary function of a shield from a historical standpoint, taking into consideration the sources and what people that use them tell us, is to defend from projectiles. That is the first reason why shields became so popular in Europe and in many other countries, for example in Africa, again in Asia, depending on the period. It's generally speaking that. You want to protect yourself from bows and arrows and all sorts of other types of projectiles, for example, even crossbow and that sort of stuff. So that is the primary function. Of course, the idea of also protecting you from spears, protecting you from swords, that's very, very important, and we see that a lot as it develops during classical warfare. But do keep in mind that differently from a lot of like formation combat and a lot of that sort of military and the development of swords and armor, bows and arrows are prehistorical. They were developed, for what we understand, as a hunting tool already in the Mesolithic period. So, you know, shields in a battlefield first is protected from projectile, and then they allow you, particularly in classical warfare, to safely get into hand-to-hand combat and strike without being hit.
Typically made of sturdy and durable material, so it can withstand multiple solid hits. A great many cultures, Japan included, understood intuitively the benefits of such a defensive item in battle. This is why conventional handheld shields, or tedate, saw widespread use in Japan from the 3rd to the 8th century.
Yeah, you're showing a samurai wielding one. Maybe it would have been nice to show a few pre-samurai warriors, since you are, of course, talking about times where all the way up to the beginning of the samurai era. But yeah, if we were to look at it in the span of time, we would notice that yes, the majority of warriors throughout Japanese history that used shields were not samurai. But then again,
while the time of the tedate was comparatively short-lived in Japan's history, for a time these wood or hide blocks of defense were paired with early Japanese swords and axes. Like other cultures that developed shields, the tedate was born out of a general principle of, if you don't want to get hit, put something else in the way. In a similar manner,
very scientific.
European knights would use their heavy shields alongside swords to be able to...
I hate that he said heavy shields. So this is probably where we are starting to see that we are having problem with whoever writing this script. So they did do some good research, I suppose, so far when it comes to Japanese history, but they didn't do any research when it comes to medieval combat, and now they're spreading misconception that I have heard. So the only case in which you have a heavy shield in medieval warfare is when you have stationary shields. Those were heavy, absolutely. But a heater shield or shields used by knights during hand-to-hand combat, or even that they were carrying as they were charging, were not heavy. When you look at heater shields, they're very thin and they're very light. And that is one of the characteristics of shields used for that sort of combat, is that they were not heavy. And one of the reasons being that they were not full metal in the majority of cases. So there is that. And that also expands to the only type of shield that we could consider to be heavy is the pavese, but that wasn't carried, it wasn't a handheld shield. That's why it was heavy. If it's handheld, it's not going to be heavy because it wouldn't work. So yeah, I do have a problem with that.
To block and counterattack as needed in single or battlefield combat. Knights would also sometimes bring handheld shields on horseback when jousting and using them as a means to parry the one-handed lances of their opponents.
It also, that one again, it depends. It depends how early of a joust we are talking about, because when joust becomes a systematic sport, and so when we look at like late medieval period and full plate armor, then shields tend to be connected. So it's not something that, oh, the lance is about to strike me and I'm gonna deviate that. That's not how it works. In fact, the shield is the target you want to hit with your lance. It works very differently, and once again, it depends on what type of joust we're talking about, but that is an important concept to keep in mind.
From these examples, we can see how the shield prolongs combat by negating the potentially fatal blows of the enemy. Using a shield this way is as simple as it gets, but when incorporated into more sophisticated maneuvers, shields can allow an entire army to advance while avoiding the worst of combat. The Roman Testudo formation was used to create an impenetrable barrier of shields.
I love that now we're talking about the Testudo. I really hope that he doesn't say anything wrong about it, because I'm a Rome fanboy and we have recreated a little bit of Testudo and we enjoyed it very much, and I'm hoping to be able to do it again. Let's go.
Protecting the lighter troops and supply animals from arrows and slings.
How is it protecting the lighter troops? No, oh my God. The Testudo was specifically used by citizen troops of the Roman Empire, which normally are referred to as heavy infantry. They are the ones that are carrying the rectangular shields of imperial period that you are showing. That's what you're showing. And they're absolutely not light troops, and so they need the Testudo. No, the Testudo was used for heavy infantry mostly.
As well as any melee weapon that could be turned aside by a shield. While Testudo might sound passingly similar to a Japanese word,
it doesn't at all. Maybe I'm being pedantic, but yeah.
It's actually Latin for tortoise, which is fitting for the formation's dome-like structure, which resembles the shell of a tortoise. It was also far from an unbeatable defense in practice.
Well, I don't think there is anything that could be considered as an unbeatable defense. I mean, even the peak of, for example, late medieval war technology, so the full plate harnesses that envelop a person's body entirely in a very functional and extremely sophisticated way by engineering design, even those are not like 100% fail-proof. If you want 100% protection, you need to sort of enter a battlefield inside a sphere of steel. That's it. No door, no window, you just roll. That's what you do. Not very effective. Just putting that one out there.
Testudo relied on every soldier who made up the formation moving at the pace of a tortoise in order to keep the multitude of shields in position.
That's kind of, I think that's your own interpretation. I've never heard that being referred in the sources. Of course, when you're doing Testudo, you will move a little slower than when you have other types of formations. But then again, I don't recall reading that, oh no, they're moving at the pace of a tortoise. That's why it's called Testudo type of thing. I don't think that's based on anything like that.
Additionally, it was extremely noticeable to any competent enemy on a battlefield, which, coupled with a lack of mobility, meant that an opposing force with significant numbers could easily surround the Testudo and keep the Romans locked in place.
Said every barbarian who tried to face the Romans on an open field and then regretted it after they have annihilated them. I think one thing that he's misunderstanding is how professional, regardless of the joke, I think what he's misunderstanding is how highly professional Roman soldiers were. A Roman would be so used to moving in formation, in all sorts of formation, because of all the drills that they did. They were professionals. That if something happens and the decision of your commander, your centurion, whatever, to form Testudo is now becoming a problem, they could revert to and change formation very, very quickly, because that's what they did. So no, they wouldn't like, oh no, now we are stuck in Testudo, so stupid, and now we're gonna be surrounded and killed. It's not that easy, and the Romans knew what they were doing. They were very, very competent.
By the 12th century in Japan, the samurai era had began, and with it came the prioritization of fast-moving formations and
Actually, starts a little earlier than that.
Overall swiftness in battle. Unlike the Roman legionnaires, the infantry of
I'm sorry, I have to do it. Please don't skip it. Skip the next 15 seconds if you hate it when I correct people in a little bit of a pedantic way. I should make a t-shirt saying, let me be a little pedantic. Let me be a little pedantic. It's legionary, not legionnaire. Because a legionnaire, like you're saying, is from the Napoleonic period. They are legionaries. In English, there is a distinction.
Japanese armies was made up of Ashigaru spear fighters who benefited from having both hands occupied by their long-range naginatas. The spear technique required
usually more than the naginata, they would use the so-called yari, so the spear. The spear is a lot more common when it comes to Ashigaru light infantry troops of the feudal Japanese era, whether it be the Heian period, whether it be the Sengoku period. Yeah, there are units that use the naginata, but usually it's kind of a special situation, a little bit like the nagamaki. The nagamaki is another very interesting type of sort of an in-between a polearm and a sword. It's a fascinating weapon. I hope to be able to own one eventually, but that's one thing that, like, we know that there was a specific corps of bodyguards of one of the shoguns that did actually use the nagamaki, but then again, yari in all of its different forms and shapes would have been a lot more common.
Required to use these weapons would have been at odds with a heavy handheld shield, much less.
You do seem to, yeah, I think this is going to be a debunking. You already knew it. And I've been here for how long without knowing it, but I think you keep pushing this idea that a handheld shield is going to be heavy, whether it be medieval Europe or whether it be feudal Japan. A handheld shield doesn't need to be heavy. Now, given some handheld shields in history that precede the medieval period were heavy, say for example the Greek aspis, so-called, sometimes called oplon, but that's an exception. And in general, the majority of shields in history were not heavy. And even the Roman shield, I mean, I can carry it. If I can use it, and I am nothing compared to a professional Roman soldier, I'm sure that they could. But I do think that it's not the weight that is the reason why Ashigaru weren't carrying shields. It's just a different type of warfare, and in my opinion, it's the range. That's why they were favoring these sort of weapons. It's the range. Similar little bit to how pikemen worked for us in the medieval period. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much.
Staying in place with several other soldiers to hunker down. The prevalence of mounted archery among the elite samurai troops also played a role in discouraging the use of heavy shields.
In early Japanese warfare.
Since the bow and arrow could not be used as effectively by an archer who was holding a shield, and the swiftness of a well-trained warhorse was often a far better defense.
This one I agree and disagree. So yes, mounted archers, absolutely, they have some advantages towards, for example, stationary archers or crossbowmen that are not mounted. There are also some disadvantages, however. It's a lot easier to train an archer to hit the target than to do that with a mounted archer, but still, there are some advantages, and that's what he's pointing out. But the idea that it's impossible for an archer to carry a shield is nonsense. Medieval archers carried shields. It's just that they would carry usually something like, for example, bucklers. A buckler, you can just wear it on your belt, for example, on your arming doublet, and then you just operate your shield. And sometimes medieval archers wore armor, and I'm talking about plate armor. You can use a bow even if you're wearing full plate, maybe not the gauntlets, but you know what I'm saying. And then if someone attacks you in hand-to-hand combat, archers could fight. You draw your sword, you take your buckler, you fight. And that's one example. But now let's look at medieval crossbowmen, like from Genoa, for example. Well, they were carrying stationary massive shields, the pavese we mentioned before, that weren't used by knights, they were used by crossbowmen. What they did is that they would carry them. Usually they would put them like on wagons, so they would put them on mounts, and then as they reached the battlefield, they would take them and then maybe put them on their shoulders, and as they are deployed, then they can put them on the ground so that they have a protection. And the Japanese did this with the Tate, by the way, so they could have a stationary protection as they shoot, because they need to reload, right? Crossbowmen's reload and rate of fire, excusing the anachronistic term, is not as fast as that of archers, and they could become exposed to enemy counter fire again while they are reloading their crossbow, and so they would hide behind these shields. So no, being an archer doesn't preclude you from carrying or using several types of shields.
Any kind of protective armor. If the dominant strategy in any
Once again, he's saying that archers can't wear armor. That's nonsense. Also because, I mean, you sort of debunked yourself. You said that samurai were mounted archers, but samurai were always armored to their teeth. So even when samurai are operating bows, and that's the same for Ashigaru, they are always armored from head to toe. Sometimes not the toe. Kinda depends. Sometimes they're wearing waraji, which blows my mind. The shoes, but whatever. So the idea that an archer can't wear armor, absolutely nonsensical.
any given time period becomes rapid assault from a distance on highly mobile steeds, the antithesis, slow-moving troops with intentionally limited attack options, quickly becomes unviable.
Believe it or not, I think one of the most effective counters to cavalry is precisely compact infantry with shields. But it only works when we're talking about highly trained professional troops with high morale. So, for example, you try and charge pikemen in the late medieval period, it can be dangerous because they were very professional. Of course, if you try and charge a militia roughly put together, they'll run away. And that's why they get destroyed, because they run away. But if cohesion is maintained, if a strong shield wall is maintained, and you've got spears, it becomes difficult to break through very disciplined troops. In fact, that technique is maintained and built upon when in the late Middle Ages, as they are trying to counter very effective and very powerful heavy cavalry charges, such as that of the gendarmes. Link in the description. I'm not talking about the police, the original gendarmes. I have a video. And then they develop pike formation into pike and shot, which means you have pikemen to protect the people with the arquebuses and the early firearms. Very, very interesting. I could make a dedicated video. Let me know if you're interested.
But to say it was just a mere trade-off between speed and defense would be reducing the nuances of practical warfare down to a set of role-playing game stats. While it's true that most Ashigaru kept both hands on their naginata, it wasn't to say that
He still says naginata, but whatever.
their armor was their only defense. The conical Jingasa hat worn by countless Ashigaru and samurai alike was more than just for show. In fact, it might be considered an example of Japanese shields hidden in plain sight.
Well, yeah, it was more than, yeah, it wasn't for show. It never was for show. First of all, and that's an interesting linguistic point, but the Jingasa, as you're saying, if you remove the jin part, which is the troop, the kanji, that kind of means soldier war troop, and you look at the other kanji remaining, it just means it's what today Japanese use to represent an umbrella. But it's this sort of hats that Japanese farmers would use to kind of protect them from the rain, which is why the word is still used in modern Japanese to mean an umbrella. So the first reason why soldiers would wear that is to protect them from the weather. That's one reason. The second, particularly with those that were made of durable materials, for example iron, was of course as a sort of helmet. Not a shield though, a helmet. You know, when you have protection on your head, it's a helmet, not a shield.
Since Jingasa were the hats of foot soldiers, most were made of leather or multiple layers of paper. But in larger and more well-funded armies, Jingasa were made from iron and sported the distinctive conical shape that would drive weapons away from the point at the top.
Absolutely, it's very correct here. But although now he's showing a kabuto helmet, is not showing a Jingasa. But still, yeah, the conical shape tends to encourage weapons to glance off, and it's one of the reasons why it became very popular in Europe with medieval knights as well, because at the end of the day, body mechanics and things that work, regardless of where these things happen in the world, because we're all humans, right? So things that work. That's why, like, a long sword, in the way it's used, is quite similar to the way, for example, a two-handed sword such as the katana or earlier types were used in the East, because at the end of the day, it's a long, sharp steel bar with a handle, a two-handed handle. And similarly, the idea of, hey, you know, if we make helmets flat like original great helms were, is not very effective, because once a blow is delivered, then such much of that force is transmitted onto my spine. So let's make them like this, which is the sugar leaf, I think it's called, sugar loaf. I always get confused. But it's a type of helmet that then, you know, great helmets will have this shape because it's just better from a mechanical standpoint.
This meant that the Jingasa was effectively designed to divert blows meant for the center of the head, though the extent to which the Jingasa was able to save the life of its wearer would vary. Like all shields and armors, its primary purpose of providing extra protection was matched in practicality by the very fact that it was worn upon an Ashigaru's head. In theory, the Ashigaru would have access to the full protection of the shield without having to sacrifice control over either hand that would be occupied by the spear.
See, this idea that, again, that it's a helmet, it's just a helmet. I think you're looking too much into it. The only way I could see maybe there is this component of the Japanese armor that could be replacing a shield. The only way I can see that is with the shoulder protection of some particularly early samurai armor. When they are big, rectangular, then I can see it a little bit. And in fact, that was my interpretation a few years ago. Can I still stick to that? But not the Jingasa.
Of course, there are downsides to placing the soldier's only means of defense right against his skull, and the primary one is how unwieldy it would be to maneuver the Jingasa in a manner that would accurately deflect multiple incoming.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say this, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but this is really silly. Because you're trying so hard to see the Jingasa not as a helmet, but as a shield, now you're thinking that this soldier is supposed to kind of move his head to intercept the blows as if it was a shield. That's absolutely not the case, first. Second, Japanese helmets of all kinds, whether it be a Jingasa, whether it be a samurai helmet, were not placed directly in contact with the skull. That is not the case. They had a filling. Let me tell you a little bit about that. Here we've got a Japanese kabuto helmet, usually used by the samurai class, but not exclusively. Now, these helmets also have, historically speaking, a liner, and in Japanese it's called an ukebari. Ukebari were traditionally made of hemp or linen, and of course they would be maintained, replaced when needed. But one interesting piece of trivia that I think kind of surprises is that they would be often bathed in incense. Similarly to the Western counterparts, the ukebari's job was of course to make the helmet more comfortable to wear. It also created a gap between the metal plating and the warrior's head. It absorbed sweat, kept the head cool, and helped absorbing the shock caused by strikes. Here I've got my very famous 15th century Italian kettle hat, and I think many of you have noticed that inside this helmet we've got what is called a liner. Now, in this case, this is a very popular one. Popular, I mean in reenactment. That is 4 different lobes that create a suspension system made of fabric inside my helmet. You see, without anything in between the helmet and your head, the ability of this object to do what it's designed for will be severely compromised. And this doesn't only apply to medieval helmets, it also applies to modern helmets. Whether it be the helmets used by the military or whether it be motorcycle helmets, all helmets have to go through extremely complicated tests to try and make sure that, for example, the liner inside, which in, for example, modern motorcycle helmets would be a sort of foam, works properly and it's the correct thickness. In this section, I would like to have a look and examine some of the actual medieval liners that are available in the archaeological record with you. And through this, I hope to be able to achieve 2 things. Number 1, I want to show you that there are different possible configurations and setups. 2, I want to stress the fact that a liner isn't just there for padding. I think we have heard this idea of you need padding under your armor, under your helmet, so much that we are starting to shift the focus of what a liner does entirely into padding. But one thing that I'm absolutely adamant about is the fact that a liner doesn't just pad, it suspends. And part of that extra protection that it grants comes because of the vacuum and the distance that it creates between your head and the top of the helmet. Let me explain. According to the sources we have, helmet liners are usually made of quilted textile and tend to be stuffed, usually with horse hair, although the stuffing material can vary. Liners are attached to suspend the head inside the helmet. We have continuous liners, so basically made of one single element, and adjustable liners, which are normally made of 4 lobes or 8 lobes. The difference between a continuous liner and an adjustable liner is that an adjustable liner allows for more versatility. Because of the eyelet and cord at the top of it, you can open and close it to increase or decrease the space between your head and the top of the helmet. In any case, with a liner present, the head will not make direct contact with the steel of the skull of the helmet. Now this is critical, because usually the space that we create between the top of the helmet, so the actual steel, and the liner is a void. So for visual referencing, we could say that your head inside a lined helmet floats. This is called a suspension method, and it's how protection is achieved in medieval helmets. The padding is only secondary. How is that so? Well, first of all, the helmet is clearly larger than the head that it's trying to protect. Therefore, the force of any impact is distributed over a larger surface area. Now, if the helmet was fully and completely filled with thick padding and complete liners that also surround the entirety of the face existed, and I have a reproduction of one of these in my frog mouth. A frog mouth helmet is sort of a particular case because of how massive some of these are and the whole way they are created and the way they work.
Coming blows. Additionally, two-handed bludgeoning weapons, like the infamous armor-crushing kanabo, a style of great club often depicted in the hands of mythological Japanese
I have one.
Oni demons, would deliver major concussive damage to the head of an ashigaru under the Jingasa, even if the conical hat survived. Even the kabuto helmet, a far more effective form of defensive headgear, could buckle under the weighty blow of a kanabo club.
Yeah, the kanabo is in fact scary to fight against, but it very much depends on how good of a hit and also how expensive of a helmet we're talking about. And also do keep in mind that these helmets were padded underneath, as I mentioned before. But yes, a hit from a kanabo, if it's well placed, full force, you did something wrong and they managed to hit you, it could really put you out of action, or it could even stun you maybe for a few seconds. But yeah, it very depends, very much depends. It's not like an anti-armor weapon that succeeds all the time, and there is that, but yeah.
And because the Jingasa was not secured to the same extent, it was never a good idea to lean into an opponent's strike if dodging was an option. However,
well, yeah, that's never a good idea.
However, the removal aspect did actually grant the Jingasa one advantage that the kabuto helmet did not have. If an ashigaru was disarmed of his primary polearm weapon, the Jingasa would be close at hand to serve as a secondary weapon. When held in hand by the straps that would otherwise tether it to the head, the Jingasa could deflect incoming blows and even use its...
Yeah, that's a good point. That when you not have it on your head, then I guess you can use it. And in fact, I have a dedicated video to that, and you'll find a link in the description. But yeah, that's the only situation in which I could see, yeah, now you're using it as a shield. But then again, you can use anything as a shield like that. You could use a door as a shield like that. That's a joke.
Pointed shape as a striking surface to hit the enemy in the face or the body. In this position...
Very true. Yeah, you can use anything. You can use this microphone to hit an enemy in the face. So it's not a specialty. It's not something that makes it special.
Position, the Jingasa becomes similar to the medieval European buckler, a compact shield that was used alongside light blades for sword fighting. There's at least one Japanese swordsmanship school that has techniques for using a Jingasa this way. The Agayu Shingan Ryu, a philosophy of total warfare that encompassed everything from the unarmed grappling moves of jujitsu to the proper form for drawing a katana in Ajutsu. It made sense that a comprehensive fighting art would develop some methods of employing a common piece of battle gear, like...
I agree with that, sort of exploring all the options. It does make sense.
Like a Jingasa into fighting, but in all likelihood it was no warrior's first plan when stepping out onto the battlefield. Especially when mounted archery was still dominating the proverbial meta-game of warfare. Well into the 14th century, there was a need for a more consistent way of blocking arrows, and one that wouldn't compromise the soldier's ability to move throughout the battlefield and launch counter-projectiles with ease.
The Tate.
With ease. Enter the Tate, a fortified combat tool with a name that literally translates from Japanese to shield. Despite its name, Tate had little in common with handheld shields.
Well, yeah, because you keep focusing on the handheld. Tate has a lot in common with the paves or pavese, but maybe you'll say it. So I don't want to try and correct you. Maybe you will say that.
Besides sharing the purpose of deflecting attacks, Tate were stationary riveted iron shields that were built to be as tall as a person and would stand in place to
not only iron
to provide cover from arrows for the soldiers behind them. They were comparable to the oblong pavis shields that were introduced to Europe in the mid-14th century.
I appreciate that you mentioned it, but it's not used that way. Oh my gosh, you're using the pavese, the big ones, because you have smaller ones, very, very small, that can be used handheld. But you're showing a big pavese, and you're using it like, you're showing the guy probably carrying it like this, even though it's actually held like this. But no, it's a stationary shield, the pavese. So no, you wouldn't have a knight in plate armor running around with a pavese shield like this.
One might assume that Tate would reduce the effective mobility of soldiers due to their intended standing cover design. But the fact that Tate stood freely actually let the soldiers use both hands to fire their bows from behind cover.
That's why I think it would have been a great example to not show a knight using a pavese like that, but to actually show the medieval crossbowmen from Genoa who did use in the exact same way. It was stationary, it would be placed, and they could hide behind it.
Compared to the previously discussed Testudo formation, Tate didn't necessarily reduce the offensive capabilities of the infantry while their protective function was in effect. The Tate simply added to the archers' safety without hindering them. And in the same measure, the bow more than made up for having to stay in one place. If the Japanese soldiers wanted to, the Tate could even provide mobile cover similar to the Testudo formation under the right circumstances. Because the iron rivets were strong enough to stop arrows and pose no risk to the body of the soldiers.
I know it's pedantic time for me today. I hope I'm not annoying you. But the fact that he said that it's the rivets. So it's the iron rivets that are blocking the arrows. So, the arrow is traveling, and you better pray all of the Japanese gods and Shinto spirits that the tip of the arrow hits the rivet. Because anywhere else, the rivet.
Retreating Ashigaru would even mount Tate's shield.
I'm sorry, I just have to keep saying it. So you know where this comes from? It comes from the fact that we often see these leather jerkins that we have seen so much in all sorts of like Viking productions, where you see that they're wearing something that is like it's leather, but then there's got these little rivets of iron, and see, people do misrepresent that and think, oh, it's the little things of iron that are actually providing protection, when in reality, the real armor, the one that I have, I'd like to show you, it's a brigandine. The rivets are not there to provide protection. They are there to connect the plates that you don't see because they are inside the otherwise silk velvet cover that creates the outside fabric of this sort of armor. The rivets are not providing protection. The rivets are providing decoration. They're beautiful to look at. In this case, they are all brass. There is over 2,000, by the way, for this specific brigandine that I have, which is an Italian, let me underline. I know it's the Leeds brigandine. I know it's in England, still Italian. It's an Italian brigandine, but as you can see, they're used there just to keep the plates of the protection, not the rivets.
To their backs while retreating to ensure that they'd escape the arrows of their pursuers raining down. When not in use, Tate could be folded into a smaller form for easy transportation and could also be hung from the sides of strongholds to provide additional shielding for the fortified buildings. Of course, the
good information.
Utility of the Tate was still something that was reserved for foot soldiers, not the elite samurai class. With few exceptions, Tate shields and horseback did not mix as strategic concepts. There were some instances of Japanese cavalry using naginatas while riding, and these units occasionally brought shields with them, like the European jousting knights. But this was rare until the 14th century, and in most cases, archery was the preferred method of mounted fighting. Appropriately enough, the implementation of the pavus across late medieval to Renaissance Europe demonstrates a parallel trend toward lessened shield use among the higher class knights. While the purpose of this video is to answer the question of why
it's not necessarily because they started using pavuses more, it was because plate armor became more protective. Although then again, it is also a myth to think, and it's something that I used to think wrongly a few years ago, it is also wrong to think that once plate armor became prevalent, then all knights stopped using shields. Now, shields are still present in the iconography. After diving into iconography for quite some time, I did reconsider. So shields were still used, they were just less common when the armor was providing most of the protection if compared to previous centuries.
Why the Japanese didn't use shields in their armies, it's worth pondering why Europe saw an apparent decline in handheld shields during roughly the same period of time. To reiterate,
it's exaggerated and it's a myth that was still used.
Shields such as the pavus and tate never really vanished from the battlefield on either landmass. But the most notable and celebrated members of the warrior castes of both Europe and Japan became significantly less likely to use them. As one might expect, advances...
Yeah, as I say, I think it has more to do with range, because once you feel confident enough in your armor, then I think range is the most important aspect, because you can hurt someone without being hurt, and therefore you can start using pole arms like pole axes, and which are complex, very versatile weapons, because you get to stab, you get to smash the enemy, sometimes you get to cut the enemy depending on what you're using, like for example even a glaive or a bill could be an example of that. So I think that could be one of the reasons. I'm more into thinking, this is my personal speculation, but I'm more into thinking that it's a matter of you gain range rather than, oh, now you don't need it anymore because shields are useless and you can just use a sword, for instance, two-handed.
Advances in the design of armor played a major role in the pivot away from shields. European full-plate armor and the complete Oyoroi armor weren't necessarily outperforming shields in durability, but they both certainly made shields less of a requirement. Being against the body automatically made armor more limited in what it could protect, as just like Japan had an effective anti-armor weapon in the kanobo, Europe had warhammers and specialized polearms, such as the bec de corben or crow's beak. A shield would definitely be a better option against such weapons, which is why the infantry still used them to avoid punishing hits. But when worn by a mounted combatant, a set of complete armor built using the technology of the 14th century provided scarce.
That is not a suit of armor built with the technology of the 14th century. That looks more like a suit of armor built with the technology of the 15th century. So that's important to say. In the 14th century, depending if it's early 14th century, it's mostly mail with like maybe a great helm and a little bit of spolders. Sometimes they have that. But as you progress into the 14th century, then 14th is very important because it's a very important time of change. Then you start having legs, so like first half and then full plate legs. And then at the end of the 14th century, that's when they start developing the breastplate. But that, like a full plate, full suit of armor, like the one you're showing with that type of helmet and that type of, it's 15th, and in fact it's late 15th to be specific.
Few weak points that a foot soldier could capitalize on. In Europe specifically, the crossbow had become one of the only threats that armor may not protect against. And even then, the strength of contemporary armor was such a thing that a bolt might not penetrate. Of course, Japan didn't have crossbows at the time, which meant that even though the Oyoroi armor wasn't exactly as sturdy as European full plate, it could still handle arrows from a distance. Apart from raw material and the completeness of coverage, the aesthetic anatomy of the armor changed to reflect the changing times. Italian armors of the 15th century began to build more heavily on the left-hand side of the suit, and this practice was carried over to British, Spanish, and French designs as well. The reason for this was expressly to compromise in some way for the lack of a shield in the offhand, which was...
Yeah, I mean, it's rather... Sure, you can put it that way. Another way to look at this is the fact that helmets, for example, or shoulder, although it's not always the case, but when it is the case that you have a bigger pauldron on the left than you have on the right, for example, in my suit of late Italian armor. As I say, it's not always the case. In German armor, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Same with English armor, sometimes they're the same size. But when you do have the bigger side, it's because it's the side that you offer to your opponent if you're right-handed. Usually that's the reason. And when it comes to the left side of the helmet, sometimes it's like full, whereas the right side will have some holes for breathing. That's because that's more likely an area where you'll be struck by a right-handed opponent. That is the reason behind the design, rather than, well, we don't have shields anymore, so we need to compensate this way. But you can look at it that way if you want, I suppose.
Generally the left, since the dominant hand would be wielding the weapon or otherwise more capable of protecting itself. Shoring up defenses in the opposite arm was a tacit acknowledgement that a shield was no longer expected to be there. In short, the myth of the Japanese samurai eschewing shields in a way...
Yeah, as I say, I don't agree with that. I think that's a myth on it in of itself, because you're sort of basing your logic on a faulty premise, which is the idea that by the 14th century and then 15th century, shields are just gone, even though they're not. Just look at the iconography. Shields are still there. They are just less prevalent, but they're still there.
Way that was vastly different from European knights at the same time is just that, a myth. By the point of history that most people focus on for the lack of Japanese shields, the same thing was taking place among the upper echelons of the nobility on European battlefields.
Well, yeah, there were a lot of similarities, absolutely. That I agree with.
Since most samurai were nobles themselves, the historical comparison is almost one-to-one. Handheld shields were already becoming a thing of the past, and since the samurai era of Japan is among the most documented by Western historians, and doubly so the most focused on by pop culture, the aesthetic of that time period became projected onto Japan as a whole, and all but erased its history of shield use. Of course, this leads us back to those stalwart counterparts, the Tate and the Pavis, which both continue to see combat.
I do like that he sort of compared, so I'll have to give them points with this. I do like showing the Pavese and the Tate together as something similar, because they are similar, not equivalent, but they are quite similar in the way they were engineered, projected, and deployed. For this part, I'll give him points.
Beyond the introduction of early firearms in their respective lands, no handheld shield could ever hope to be as defensive against guns as the stationary tower variants. Due to both density and size differences, the design of guns as ranged weapons that required reloading and maintenance also meant that they could be seamlessly integrated as replacements for bows and crossbows
Well, not replacements though, and I mean, at first I sort of commended you for saying that still, even when there were early firearms, bows and arrows were still a thing, but now you're sort of going against that and you're saying that they are replacing them. They didn't replace them. I mean, the sort of early firearms that we're talking about in the, say, early 15th century and then 16th century, they're very important, they're very effective, but they're not like completely removing the idea of the need for bows and arrows and crossbows. You'll have to wait until the 17th century before that actually happens, and 18th century before that actually happens.
For infantry without removing the standing shield from the equation. Rather than spelling the end of such shields, the advent of firearms gave them a new
I love the drawing of the matchlock that they drew. It's very well drawn.
lease on usefulness. Most surprisingly, these kinds of shields were effective most in the hands of the very infantry gunmen who were reshaping the battlefield around their weapons. Ashigaru truly came into their own through the use of firearms, and their on-foot tactics continued to develop side by side, but wholly separate from more refined samurai fighting arts of mounted combat and swordsmanship. During the Sengoku era, the amount of Portuguese arquebus guns flooding into Japan was astronomically more than what was available in many parts of Europe, thanks to tactically minded lords.
This is also kind of a strange way to put it. It's not that, yes, the introduction of firearms from the West, I support it. I support that idea. I think that's how it happened. Some people think it's a little controversial and they think it's not the case. I do. I still stand with sort of main academia when it comes to that view. I think they were introduced by the Portuguese, but one thing that did not happen is that it's not that they were introduced en masse. They were introduced in some samples, and then the Japanese used those samples to copy them and mass produce them themselves, and that's why they're called Tanegashima, which is the name of the island, which is in the south of Japan, where these were initially manufactured and mass-produced. So the Japanese produced them locally, based on the Western models. It's not that they bought them en masse, also because I doubt that the Portuguese would have sold them that many.
Lords like Oda Nobunaga, who saw the potential in these foreign arms. The 16th century saw Japan become an almost testing ground for the arquebus. While many samurai would come to wield their power, it was the Ashigaru who proved the practicality of using these guns in droves. And just as the Ashigaru evolved through adopting the arquebus, new strategies augmented the viability of the Tate as total cover. Since on its own, a Tate is unlikely to remain intact after direct fire from an arquebus, the Ashigaru learned to suspend rolled bundles of straw in front of the shields, not in order to stop the bullets, but to force them to meet resistance and slow down. A row of these
Yeah, this section, I have to say, it's pretty nice. So I'm appreciating this part and the explanation that they're giving about the way the tate were enhanced.
These bamboo straw bundles, or taketaba, would be positioned ahead of a row of tate, creating a cheap, effective battlement that could be propped up wherever a battle was going to take place. Just as Europe had moved towards siege warfare, the ability to set up fortifications anywhere was very attractive to the rank-and-file members of the samurai armies. For all the aforementioned reasons, the demands of mounted combat, weapon choice, and overall tendencies toward more effective armor, the battlefield experience of most samurai remained distant from the struggles of the Ashigaru. This isn't to say, however, that their lack of handheld was, even at the height of samurai warfare, unaccounted for in a detrimental way. In much the same way that historians can tell when shields started to become less common among knights by the shape of their armor, we can deduce that wearers of the Oyoroi armor have a form of built-in protection that supersedes the shield and more or less replaces it. Why carry an unwieldy shield or strap one to your head when the shoulders of your armor could serve as your two large shields in their own?
Yeah, so he mentioned the same thing that I mentioned earlier. I do tend to agree with that.
Own right. The massive lamellar pauldrons, or osode, on the Oyoroi were both...
I've never heard anyone call them lamella or lamella, like you say. I'm not talking about the pronunciation, I'm talking about the word. I don't think I've never heard anyone call them lamella, but...
both sturdy and flexible, protecting the wearer from arrows and melee weapons while also still allowing the samurai enough freedom of movement to fire a bow. During a mounted charge...
Very true. One thing I'd like to add to this is that do keep in mind that the Oyoroi, as a specific type of armor, was extremely heavy. And in fact, if you were... and it hung mostly on your shoulders. So by comparison, if you look at a 14th century Oyoroi samurai and a 14th century medieval knight, the samurai would be wearing a heavier armor. That's not the case as you progress in the 15th and 16th century. Then that's when like medieval knights tend to wear armor that tends to be heavier than the usual Japanese samurai. And of course, even in the 14th century, there were lighter configurations. But since he mentions the Oyoroi, I kind of wanted to add that. Don't think, since he mentioned about lightning strike and super speed of the samurai, that applies to samurai that wore Oyoroi. Only the very wealthy samurai could afford the very protected Oyoroi, but those that did, anything but light, quick, and sort of light on their feet.
The pauldrons would protect the non-dominant side of the attacker, allowing them to lean their shoulder toward their adversary to avoid incoming damage. This worked in conjunction with the kabuto or jingasa and was fastened to the armor rather than built in.
This is similar to the video that I sort of responded to, link in the description, about samurai combat, where also the practitioner, who was I think a ninjutsu practitioner, was talking once again about leaning towards, so someone is attacking you with a sword, you want to hit it with your head, or in this case you want to hit it, as he says, with a helmet, with the jingasa, with the shoulder. I don't understand that. I don't understand the martial value, and please correct me if you know better than me. I just don't understand the martial value of trying to hit an incoming attack or strike with your head or with any piece of your armor. You want to deflect, you want to avoid, and if you're being hit, then you hope that the armor will protect, and usually it will. I don't understand this idea of, oh, I'm going to try and hit and intercept it with my head, or like he said before, or intercept it with my shoulder, leaning towards the attack. I don't get that.
Reducing the weight and displacing whatever trauma the osode receives away from the wearer. The osode was one of the many aspects of the oyoroi that were both elegant and catered towards specific purposes. Some parts of the suit were designed to make archery more effective, like the yugake gloves, which were made of smooth animal hide. Others were defensive modifications, like the osode that the average Japanese foot soldier couldn't dream of having. The kote, or armored sleeves, were another such addition, which could protect a samurai from most slashing attacks in unmounted combat.
And there were lots of different types of configurations, and also we have mentions of samurai actually removing and even Ashigaru, because Ashigaru could wear the sword, to sort of untie them and let them drop so that you can then more easily operate a bow. But then if you think you're going to go into hand-to-hand combat, you put them back up and you can tie them up with your teeth. I've tried it myself. So it's very versatile is what I'm trying to say.
Much like the 16th century knights, a samurai lord in a oyori suit was pretty much a different class than the foot soldiers.
Oyoroi is gone by the 16th century completely. We are talking about the 16th century type of armor that is much more low profile. That's, for example, that's the armor that I own. But Oyoroi in 16th century, it would have been like crazy to see that. It would have been like, why are you wearing that? Antique.
And wouldn't have as much need for a shield when fighting them. The powerful fire of an arquebus was the biggest threat a samurai could face on a frequent basis, and the introduction of tamashi gozoku, or bullet-tested armor, meant that armor would remain a part of samurai battles up until the Tokugawa shogunate. This is all
very true. Tamashi Gosoku is the one that they tested, that they proofed. That's probably where bulletproof comes from, by the way, because they have a proof. You have a little sign. We did it in Europe as well with medieval arms and armor. But yeah, it wouldn't have been an Oyoroi.
All to say that in both Europe and Japan, the shield became a poor man's suit of armor. And as warfare itself continued to increase in deadliness and speed, the benefits of negating damage were outweighed by the benefits of killing the opponent before being killed. So why didn't the Japanese use shields? Well, they did, to a slightly lesser extent than Europe, and then relied on them even less around the same time that Europe had begun to move past them. It all comes down to an acknowledgement that changing paradigms in combat means that not all tools are effective forever. There's another question that comes to mind when taking this.
Well, yeah, I agree. I mean, warfare is ever evolving because, of course, you get a better weapon. I need to create a better piece of armor or defense, and then you'll have to once again come up with something that works against that, and it's a constant race, the sort of race of arms, if you will.
This all into account. Where did this common belief that the Japanese didn't use shields come from? While it might be tempting to blame this gap in knowledge on the cultural austerity of Western academia, this would be highly reductionist, especially because it seems that most scholars agree on the idea that the Japanese did in fact,
yeah, it's pop culture, it's not academia,
to use shields outside of the samurai caste. It would seem instead that this myth is born out of the human tendency to personify the past as individuals, to imagine that battles are won by the singularly honorable samurai, the brave knight, or the cunning general. When these amalgamated figures become the focus of the layman's fascination with bygone eras,
I still think it's pop culture.
the countless less fortunate foot soldiers who truly won the battles are overlooked. And if we know one thing about the peasants who were pressed into service for feudal lords and were forced to race into the certain doom of territory struggles, it's that any one of them could find a use for a shield.
I've debunked videos that are much worse than this, but there were quite a few things that were pushed as facts. For example, as I said, how heavy shields were and these other points. Overall, I hope that you enjoyed this video as usual, and this is not a direct attack to the creators. As I always mention, I'd like to mention it again. Just perhaps an encouragement to do a little more research when it comes to these topics. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron spread his wings. Goodbye.